The Number One Car Spotter by Antonook. Chapter 1. On the continent of Africa, you will find my country. In my country, there are many cities, all with skyscrapers, hotels, offices. There are also small towns, all with tap water and electricity and televisions. Then there is my village, where we can only talk of such things. Our village has a few compounds, many goats, and several cows. It is in between the forest, the river, and the road, the main road, the road that brings the cars past our village. Between are many cars speeding towards the cities and the towns. There are a few people in our village. My best friend Coca-Cola lives on the compound with his old grandmother, his newborn sisters, Sunshine and Smile, and his mother, Ma Coca-Cola. My sister's best friend Nike lives in another compound with her two elder brothers, Emergency and Tuesday, her father, Uncle Go Easy, Bika, Baisai, and Bola. The small children live with their mother, Ma B, Auntie, and Auntie Fine Fine. There are also other people in the compound, but these are the people who know me well. I live in a compound with my grandfather, who taught me everything I know, with my grandmother, who wants me to obey everything she knows, and my sissy, who thinks I know nothing, and with my mother, who loves and feeds and looks after us all. My father, of course, lives in the city. Let me introduce myself. My name is Owala Wasa Bubatun Benson, but everyone calls me Number One. The Number One. I am Number One car spotter in the village. Car spotting is the only hobby in this village. My grandmother, Ma, and all the aunties think that no such hobby should be allowed. Spotting cars does not take the goats to the grass, grandmother complains. It does not water the cows, Mom insists. Cars do not collect firewood, Auntie Fine Fine confesses, or carry yams from the village, Ma Coca-Cola agrees. Cars won't fill your belly, Sissy joins in. Sissy thinks spotting cars should be banned by the government. Sissy thinks that because I spot cars, I am not doing my share of the work, but that is not true. I work hard all day. I do everything Ma and grandmother and Coca-Cola mother and my Auntie Fine Fine and Uncle Go Easy and everyone else in the village tell me to do. But while I'm doing that, I spot cars. Who can help spotting cars when the road runs directly past the village? It is what men do. Grandfather sits under the Iroko tree in the center of the village, shouts out, "Firebird!" Uncle Go Easy wastes deep into the river, pulls in his nets and shouts, "Pegoot 505. Tuesday, an emergency, clearing the bushes for the new field. Hear the engine shout out, "Mercedes 914. Coca-Cola and I, high on the palm trees collecting nuts, shout, "Austin Martin, DB5. Our village may be poor, lost in the bush, but Number One road goes directly past it. And I am the Number One car spotter. I can spot them before I see them. From the sound of their engines, the running sweet or the backfiring, I know them. Egwood, Suzuki, Land Cruiser. It is grandfather who taught me to be a car spotter. He spends his old age underneath the Iroko tree, watching the road. When I was a baby, I stayed with him, and when I was a baby, I stayed with him there in the shade of the tree while Ma worked on the farm. Grandfather taught me my ABCs, my 1, 2, 3s, Paragoot, Passut, Passit, Porsche. What Godfather doesn't know What grandfather doesn't know about spotting cars is not to know, is not known. Grandfather and I love cars, but I love the Corolla the best. It is the number one and only car in our village. One time when I was very small, I heard the engine from afar. Grandfather told me what it was. Toyota Corolla, he said. He held me up on a small legs to see. I saw the dust, I saw the smoke, I saw the Toyota Corolla crawl into the village. I saw it cut right out in front of me. I saw the driver call a taxi to return to the town with his head in his hands. Since the Corolla has been there in the heart of our village, every time my cousin Whale, the mechanic, comes from the town, he looks at it and shakes his head. It will not go. It will never carry us around like rich people, but it will stay my favorite car. I often dream I will drive this car along the road fast. Number 1, what are you dreaming about? Go and carry the yams to the field, shouts Mama suddenly. Pick mangoes and oranges, ripe and sweet, called Grandmother. Bring my beans, commanded Ma Coca-Cola. The palm oil, Aunt Fine joined in. I started to run all the directions. Coca-Cola, Sissy, Emergency Tuesday, and Nike joined me. Even Beck, Basai, and Bola started carrying baskets higher than themselves from the storeroom. All the mothers and aunties and grandmothers were shouting at once. The next day was market day. We would sell our palm oil, our yams, our onions, our tomatoes, and our chili peppers, our baskets, our dried fish, our oranges, mangoes, rice, etc. With the money we would buy important things we need. The money would buy the important things we need that not only money can buy: salt, sugar, kerosene for lamps, pencils, shoes for school, and sweets. Those things can't grow in our fields, or be picked from the trees of the forest, or hunted in the bush, or fished from a river. I was running back with a basket of ripe mangoes on my head when I heard a sharp crack. Grandmother screamed, and all the aunties started crying. Emergency Tuesday had been pulling the old wagon cart into the position and ready to load with all our goods for the market when we heard a crack, wailed Mom B. Like a gun firing, moaned Mom Coca-Cola. But it was the old cart, Mom cried. Only God can save us now, wept Aunt Fine. We were gathering around the cart, wringing our hands and tearing at our clothes. Coca-Cola, Sissy, and Nike and I pushed in to see. The cart had broken, snapped in half. How will I sell my palm oil, wailed Aunt Fine. How will I sell my yams, wailed Mama. How will I sell my oranges and my mangoes, wailed Grandmother. No pencils for school, Sissy sobbed. No sweets, Coca-Cola, and I looked at each other. Our cart must be fixed, shouted Mama B. Coca-Cola and I ran to help Grandfather up from underneath the Iroko tree. Grandfather used to be a carpenter, the village carpenter. He walked stiffly around the cart, then he shook his head. This one will never go again, he said. You see, shouted Grandmother, this is where your car spotting has gotten you. You are now a useless old man. Grandfather shook his stick at her. In the days when the village was full of men, we would cut down a tree, plane the wood, fix the cart. In a village that has become useless, It is the village who has become useless, not the man, he shouted. Grandmother sighed. She knew it was true. All the men in the village, except for grandfather and Uncle Go Easy, now live in the city, trying to find jobs and earn money to pay for shoes, medicine, and schooling for us and their families. Father was there. Coca-Cola's father was there. Even some of the women were there. Before our village was full of women, Ma sighed. We could have carried everything to the market on our heads. Now everybody loves to live in the city, wailed Mama Coca-Cola. We are left with a broken cart. And grandmother sucked her teeth. And a broken man. How will we get to the market and back? Cried Sissy. Grandfather sadly shook his head. He sat down on the back of the Corolla to rest his old legs. I looked at the broken cart. I looked at grandfather sitting on the broken Corolla. Can't we make that machine work? Demanded grandfather, unreasonably pointing at the Corolla. Who loves cars so much? Grandfather shook his head again. This one, he said, patting the Corolla, will never run again. Is that all you can say? Shouted the women. Grandfather shrugged his shoulders and raised his hands. I looked from grandfather on the Corolla to the women in the cart. Suddenly, a light switch went on in my brain. I, who did not even know I had electricity was firing in my legs. I started to run. Number 1, where are you going? Shouted Mama. Hola, wasabi, babatud. Benson, stop, shouted grandmother. Come here, wait for me, shouted Coca-Cola. I did not stop. I could not wait. The current was running and there was no off switch. I did not stop at the river. I did not stop at the farm. I ran all the way through the bush to the town. It took me from morning until night was about to fall. I zigzagged through the houses until I saw my cousin's corrugated iron shop. The ground all around was littered with rags, scraps, and metals, black with the oil that the cars like to drink. Well, I banged on the door. Come back tomorrow, the voice replied. It's me, number 1, I shouted. The door opened. Oh, hola, Sabi Babatun Benson, my cousin, he exclaimed. Small brother. He acknowledged that, indeed, we had the same grandmother and the same grandfather. Why, Tin, he wanted to know what I was doing here in town, all alone, banging on his door at night. I told him my idea. I told him everything. Slow down, he says at first. And then he said, nah, which means wow. He called his friends and drew my idea in the dirt for them to look at. I was just a small kid compared to them. I had a big idea. He nodded their heads, collected the equipment, and together we ran back to the village. When we arrived, it was deep in the night. Look at that. Grandmother and Ma were waiting for me, crying. Do you want to kill me, Mom? Shouted. Do you know that the crocodiles and the leopards and the towns eat small boys like you? Grandmother shouted. Lazy boy, shouted Sissy from the house. She had to do my work all day. But I did not stop to defend myself. I kept running until we reached the Corolla. We were off, loaded the equipment, and set to work right away. There was no time for palvilla, no time for wallow, no time for all of this shouting. Tomorrow is market day. The whole village woke when the metal started grinding against the metal. All the people gathered around and red sparks flied from the screaming. All the people gathered around, red sparks flying from the screaming Corolla. Only Coca-Cola's old grandmother stayed sleeping on her mat. Grandfather came to stand beside me. He put his hands on my shoulder. Keusi o Iwan Omo mine. Good work, he said to Whale and his friends. Adupe o, Grandfather replied. Thank you. When the stars began to fade and the metal kissed the red metal together, the dawn was bright in the sky. The machines were silent and the mechanics were still. Grandmother opened her mouth. Shh, said Grandfather. I left the chopped up Corolla and went to the river, down to the river, and brought up all the cows to the village and hitched them up to Now who, gasped Mother. Now who, shouted Grandmother. Na woo, whispered my sister. Sorry-o, they all said again and again. Sorry. Ma Coca-Cola, Aunt Fine Fine were screaming with joy. Uncle Go Easy was walking around and around our new cart, shaking his head and wondering. I had led the cows around the village. It worked perfectly. Whale and his friends whooped and shouted and jumped into each other's arms. They had won the World Cup. Grandfather shook his hands, and then he shook my hand. Congratulations, he said. The fruit does not fall far from the tree, Mom said. Grandfather and I smiled at each other. It was inside my head that the light switch had come on. But it was Grandfather who had done the wiring. Then Grandfather shouted, there are the yams, the onions, and the peppers, and the mangoes, and the oranges, and the dried fish, and the rice, and the palm oil. Is the village not going to the market today? I laughed to see Mama and the aunties and the grandmothers all jumping up and starting to run around in every direction. Number 1 car spotter, that's me, getting our village to the market and back in our new Toyota Corolla. Chapter 2, Number 1 goes to market. Come on, remember me? Sowasi Batun, number 1 car spotter, number 1 car spotter in the village, number 1 car spotter in the world. Look at us now, number 1 village escorting the new Toyota Corolla into market. We had to load it with baskets high with yams, onions, tomatoes, plantains, chili peppers, mangoes, oranges, dried fish, rice, and palm oil. This cart is strong, crowd, Mom. This no fit break, agreed Grandmother. This cart fit to rock and stone, Mama beat proudly. We sang the praises to the cart all the way to market, and when the market people saw us with our number 1 vehicle, you should have heard the shouts. What's this? Can you believe it? Ah, check out the village pickup. Nah, new off-road style. Every man, woman, and child ran to see our ordinary village cows could be pulling a wonderful imported Corolla. Mom and the aunties got busy offloading the goods, but the men got busy telling everybody about what happened. My boy achieved electricity from the brain, Grandfather boasted. The mechanic boys were sparking all night. Uncle Go Easy joined from his dried fish stall. It was easy well. And then all the women stopped listening to us because Mom and the aunties had to finish off loading, and suddenly we're surrounded by fat red tomatoes, skinny biting chili peppers, rice fresh from the stalk, pungent dry fish, golden palm oil, the best in the market. The women were wondering what they had come to the market for. Then Ma Coca-Cola started frying Caraca, and then all the men were gone. Grandfather went to sleep in the cart. Whale disappeared with his friends, but I kept busy helping Mom and the aunties and Uncle Go Easy to sell. Bag, you need a bag, Mom questioned a customer. Bring a bag for this lady. Bring a bag for this lady. Change, bellowed Ma Coca-Cola. I need some small change. Fresh water, coughed Mama B. Thief, screamed Grandmother. Catch that boy. Reclaim our mangoes. I was busy running back and forth in the heap, but I did not complain, not for 1 second. Nor did Sissy, Nike, and Coca-Cola, and Emergency, and Tuna, and Tuesday. The more tomatoes and fish and oil we sold, the more pencils, sugars, flip-flops our mothers could buy for us. So we were like Olympic runners, quick off the market, and we'd jump the gun, and nobody complained. When the sun was high in the sky, the customers started to dry up. The baskets were low, and the best of everything was gone. Ma and the aunties did not need help anymore, but I saw Auntie Fine beckon to Sissy. She whispered into Sissy's ear, and Sissy started to smile. Sissy's smile grew so wide I wanted to know what she thought she would put there. I wondered what she thought that would put that smile there. I could read Auntie Fine's lips. How much? Ask how much. When Sissy ran off into the market, I beckoned to Coca-Cola. We followed Sissy past the plantain sellers and the plastic cup traders, past the goats and the chickens and the plastic shoe traders and the mounds of yarn cloth. Suddenly, Sissy stopped by the small stall loaded with small bottles and jars. The containers were all different colors, red, pink, and so on. Some shaped long like a tube, some small bottles with a lid like fat pencils, some round, fat boxed with all painted women smiling wide. I braked behind a mountain of wax cloth. Coca-Cola crashed into me, and we nearly avoided toppling the new clothes into the dirt. I gave Coca-Cola a dirty look. No brake light, no indicator, he hissed at me. I go book you. Sorry, officer. I beg you. I tried not to laugh. Sissy turned around and looked. She shouted, "Don't think I don't see you there, number one. Did anyone send you here?" "I don't think so. Just wait until I tell Ma." Everyone in the stalls heard Sissy's words, and they all turned around to look. My face was red hot. I turned and ran back. Coca-Cola got there before me, hiding behind the Cairula. Grandmother looked at me with narrow eyes. Quickly, I looked down at the ground. I was littered with squashed tomatoes and sweet wrappers. I grabbed Mom's broom and started to sweep. Grandmother smiled at me. I was just about to load the empty baskets into the cart and take the opportunity to court-martial Coca-Cola for deserting me under enemy fire when Sissy arrived back empty-handed. I busied myself sweeping. Sissy looked at me and opened her mouth loud. But before I could speak, Aunt Fine beckoned her. Price. I saw her ask. Sissy bent and whispered in her ear, and then straightened to look at me. As she opened her mouth again, Mobby called, "Where have you been, sissy? I wanted you and Nike to take Beck, Isai, and Viola to buy plastic shoes. Good quality and cheap. Now go a while they're still there." Sissy's mouth was still open. She was looking at me, but Ma shut her mouth for her by saying, "Did you not hear your auntie? What are you waiting for? Go." Sissy and Nike went off into the market, holding Beck, Isai, and Viola. I put down the brush in a heavy sigh of relief. Aunt Fine Fine was calling after Sissy, but Sissy was gone. And shopping with Beck and Isai and Viola could take a long time. You didn't need a brain to know that. Auntie Fine Fine looked around, despondent, and caught me looking at her, and she smiled. "Number one," she called. I tried to hide behind my broom. "Number one," Aunt Fine Fine called again. I saw Ma look at me when I didn't answer. "Yes, Auntie," I answered. "Come here, good boy, Aunt Fine Fine. I want you to do something for me." Ma narrowed her eyes at me, waiting for me to answer. What could a boy my size do in such a situation? "Yes, Auntie," I said again and went to Aunt Fine Fine. "Do you know the stall that sells many small bottles and containers?" she asked. "Yes, Auntie, I do." I looked around desperately for Coca-Cola. His legs were disappearing into the Corolla. They were going nowhere with me. "I want you to go there and buy me," Aunt Fine Fine gestured me to come closer. Grandmother looked up. "Lipstick," Aunt Fine Fine whispered and pressed the money into my hand. Grandmother's eyes widened. "Go, Aunt Fine Fine." I looked at Ma. She had not heard Aunt Fine say lipstick. Her eyes said, "Obey or else." So I went, past the plantains, plastic cups, the chickens and the goats, and the plastic shoes where Sissy had stared at me and sucked her teeth. When I got to the cloth stall again, I stopped. I prayed that the stall I was headed for had gone, but I didn't know what lipstick was. But it was women's business, and women's business was not for a small boy like me. I didn't want the whole market to look at me again. But there it was, with small bottles and jars, boxes of colored chili peppers, and this time even more girls. I was ready to wait behind the cloth until they were gone, but the big man pushed me into the open. "Can you let the man pass?" he shouted. All the girls turned around. Suddenly, I opened my shoulders and made myself stand tall. I was number one. What was I afraid of? I pushed my way to the front of the stall, as if it was nothing to me to be there. I stared at the bottles and the jars. Which one was lipstick? The trainer leaned over the jars and looked at me. "What is a small boy like you doing here? This is not where you will find a football match or a computer game." The girl started to giggle. Quickly, I picked up one of the small jars, as if I knew what I was doing. I pushed Auntie Fine Fine money into the trader's hand, and then I ran away. I ran all the way back to give the jar to my Aunt Fine Fine. I started to join Coca-Cola in the Corolla, but before I had a chance to walk two steps, Aunt Fine Fine cried out, "What is this thing? This is not what I asked for you to buy. What am I supposed to do with this? Where's my money?" All the woman turned and looked at me, but it was too late to run. "Number one," shouted Mama. "What have you done?" "Nothing, Mama," I answered. "I don't know. What kind of answer is that?" Mother demanded. I could see plenty of trouble coming and no sweets after all my hard work. Ma stood up. Grandfather woke up to see what all the commotion was about. Coca-Cola's feet were trembling on my behalf. Aunt Fine was still shouting and everyone was looking at me. Suddenly, Grandmother said, "Don't blame the boy. This woman sent him to buy lipstick." And there was suddenly a silence as Grandmother's words were being absorbed. Then all the aunties started to laugh. Ma laughed the loudest and patted my shoulders. Aunt Fine stopped shouting and started to cry. The laughing aunties gathered around to comfort her. Aunt Fine's mouth was open so wide there was no room for her face or her eyes. "My money, oh, unless things for all my money, oh," she cried. Sissy arrived back then, dragging Becca, Bias, and Viola. She looked at me. She looked at Aunt Fine. She looked at the jar in Auntie's fine hand. Sissy took the jar. She winked at me. She opened the jar, bent down, and busied herself at Aunt Fine's feet. None of the aunties took any notice, and they were all too busy comforting. Aunt Fine suddenly, they were all too busy comforting Aunt Fine. Suddenly, Sissy stood up. The aunties shrieked. Grandmother fell from her stool. Coca-Cola's head appeared over the top of the cart. Grandfather shouted, "What?" They were all staring at Aunt Fine's feet. Aunt Fine closed her mouth in order to see what was going on. She looked at our bulging eyes. She looked down to see what they were ogling at. Her toenails. They were pink, a bright hibiscus pink. Aunt Fine did not move for almost 1 minute. She slowly smiled. She laughed. She clapped her hands. She rose to her feet and started to admire herself. All the other aunties commenced laughing and clapping too. Aunt Fine started to dance right there in the market. Then Aunt Fine came towards me, Grandfather gripping my shoulder. "Clever boy," Aunt Fine shouted. "Go buy me one," Mama B demanded. "A red one. I want a red one," called Mama Coca-Cola. "Clever boy," Aunt Fine repeated, squeezing my cheeks. She pressed some money into my hand. It was enough to buy sweets and fritters. I smiled, my number one smile. Now all the aunties were pressing their money in my hand. Go buy, they shouted. I looked up at Grandfather. His eyebrows were raised. Mama was laughing. Grandfather was shaking her head. Trouble had been shaking me with my teeth now as it was throwing me back into the stall. It was time to go. We're tired. We were happy to load up our salt, sugar, kerosene, clothes into the Corolla and ride home. Speaking for myself, my stomach was so full of fritters and sweets I could not have walked. But not Aunt Fine. Aunt Fine insisted on walking, and I could see my feet better like this, she said. I looked down at Aunt Fine's feet flashing in the road. Porsche, I said to Coca-Cola, looking up down the road. Where? I nodded down at Aunt Fine's toes, flashing the dirt. Coca-Cola and I laughed. 10 pink Porsche convertibles were stirring up the dust. Chapter 3, 7-Up. Greetings from number 1. Number 1 car spotter in my village, maybe number 1 car spotter in the whole world. One time I came close to losing my name. One time. It happened like this. When I am not with my grandfather under the Iroko tree spotting cars, I am with Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is my tight friend. He has the coolest name in the village. Coca-Cola got his own name because his mother, Ma Coca-Cola, sells Akara by the roadside. She fries it exactly with the right blends of beans and onions, chili peppers, salts to hit chili peppers and salt to hit a person's pocket. The smell travels straight from the person's nose into their person's belly. From there, it goes directly into the person's cash, which lands immediately in Ma Cola's hand. The akara tastes so good that once you have eaten it, you have to eat more. And once you have eaten, you need to take something to make more room. And nothing washes akara down better than Ma's Coca-Cola. Nothing washes down akara down better, Ma Coca-Cola knows, than a cold soft drink. So Ma Coca-Cola stores her soft drinks in the river in order to serve them chilled. It's Coca-Cola's job to carry the Coca-Cola, Fanta, 7-Up, Sprite from the river to the customer. Ma's Coca-Cola's shorthand way of telling him that the customers are waiting for drinks to shout Coca-Cola at the top of her voice. Once upon a time, Coca-Cola had a traditional name, but now everyone just calls him Coca-Cola. One day I was with Coca-Cola in his compound when it was time for him to eat. Of course, Ma Coca-Cola called me to eat also. Akara is not the only food Ma Coca-Cola knows how to cook well. I ate and ate and ate, and in the end, my belly weighed so much I could not carry myself back to my own compound to sleep. When Coca-Cola lay down for the night, I collapsed next to him. In the morning, as soon as I woke up, I knew that I was in Ma Coca-Cola's house instead of being surrounded by the noise of my family already at work, sweeping the compound and washing the clothes. I was surrounded by snores. Coca-Cola's family likes to sleep. Maybe it's because of the mountains of food they consume on a nightly basis. A full belly loves to sleep, and it has no need to complain, no need to wake. The rest of the village wakes early, before the first crow, before the first light, and every morning when they're already hard at work, we already heard Ma Coca-Cola waking up with a snout. Then we see her run down to her stall, still trying to fry some akara with Sunshine and Smile, still at her breast, and the first bus has passed. This morning, they all still were snoring when I woke. It was dark, but I sat up immediately. Grandmother had been needling me to collect firewood. Ma would be calling me to hoe the fields. Sissy would need my help with the goats. I sit up, woke Sunshine and Smile. They opened their baby eyes and stared at me and started to laugh, then cry for food. Ma Coca-Cola opened her eyes. She looked to the window to see how much of the morning she had already passed. When she saw that the sun had not reached the sky, that only the cockerels crowing and the sound of the village waking up was indicative of the impending arrival. Ma Coca-Cola was so happy. She jumped to her feet. She squeezed my cheeks and started shouting, "Onions, beans, frying pans, stool." Coca-Cola shot off his mat and started to run around. As I was able-bodied boy in the vicinity of the shouting mama, I started to run around as well. By the time we had collected everything, Ma Coca-Cola had fed Sunshine and Smile and adjusted her repa. She was ready to go down to her position on the road. Before the village knew what was happening, the smell of akara had filled the air, and those who had not eaten found their bellies propelling their legs towards last night's leftovers. The first bus arrived. Coca-Cola and I started to run. We laughed as we ran to the river. Happily, I loaded my arms with bottles. Ran for Ma Coca-Cola meant Acura for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I was licking my fingers when when the second bus arrived. Coca-Cola, 7 Up, Ma Coca-Cola shouted. I was happy to run back to the river. I would run wherever Ma Coca-Cola's Acura. On the way I passed Sissy, my sister, taking our goats to graze in the hot, dusty brush. Number 1, she shouted, come here and take your goats to the grass. I am answering Ma Coca-Cola, I shouted back. Sissy sucked her teeth. Greedy boy, she shouted. I ignored her. I was just licking my fingers when 3 BMWs stopped in front of Ma Coca-Cola's stall. Coca-Cola and I started running. I passed grandmother. Number 1, firewood, she shouted. I shouted back, I answer Ma Coca-Cola. Grandmother shook her broom at me. Just wait till I catch you, she shouted. But I knew she couldn't. On the way back, we passed the Iroka tree. Emergency was sitting there with grandfather. Mammy's wagon, Emergency shouted. I looked down the road, and there was Mammy's wagon approaching, rocking from side to side with many passengers. I offloaded my bottles into Coca-Cola's arms and turned around to the back of the river for more. You're allowing your stomach to rule your legs, grandfather said on my way back. I pretended I didn't hear him. The following morning, I woke up again. Ma Coca-Cola's house. The previous evening, I had allowed her to reward my hard work with the mountain of delicious food. Once again, I sat up in the dark, sunshine and smiling, for starting to clamor for food. Ma Coca-Cola opened her eyes and smiled. By the time the first bus arrived, the Acura was ready. Coca-Cola, 7 Up, Ma Coca-Cola shouted. The fresh Acura had fueled my engine. My legs were pistols and carrying me down the river. On the way I passed Ma. She was going to wash our clothes in the river. Good morning, Coca-Cola. Good morning, 7 Up, she shouted. My engine stuttered as I passed Sissy and Nike and their heads loaded with firewood. Look, it's the soft drinks, said Sissy. Good morning, Coca-Cola. Good morning, 7 Up, Nike giggled. My engines faltered. On the way back from the river, we saw Uncle Go Easy. You boys, Coca-Cola, 7 Up, he shouted. Make sure you're not to touch my fishing nets when you go to the river. I braked immediately. Stop, I shouted to Coca-Cola. I loaded all my soft drinks on top of his. What happened, he asked. Tell your mother that grandfather is waiting for me to sweep the yard. I have to escort the goats to the bush, and Sissy and Mama are waiting for me to take care of everything. Don't you want to eat Acura? Coca-Cola asked. I didn't answer. I ran into our compound. So, grandmother said, did your belly tire of superior food? Yes. No, grandmother, I replied, looking meekly on the ground. What are you waiting for? She snapped. Sweep the compound, take the cows to drink in the river, take your goats to the bush. Don't come back until you have collected firewood. Go. Down by the river with the cows, I met Coca-Cola with his arms loaded with soft drinks. He looked at me sadly. Down by the river with the cows, I met Coca-Cola. His arms were loaded with soft drinks. He looked at me sadly. Why didn't you stay with me? He said. Coca-Cola, I said. I am number 1. The number 1. I am not 7 Up. But why? Said Coca-Cola. What's wrong with 7 Up? Because I said, number 1 is number 1. Who wants to be called 7 Up when you can be number 1? Number 1 is first in line. 7 has to wait till 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 have all passed before you reach him. Coca-Cola said nothing. He looked at the river. Then he said, I am Coca-Cola. That, I said, is because Coca-Cola is the number 1 soft drink. Some people prefer Fanta. It's true. Some people prefer Sprite. Some people don't touch Coca-Cola, but Coca-Cola is still number 1. And before either of us could say anything more, we heard Ma Coca-Cola shouting, "Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola, where's my boy?" Coca-Cola ran back. I walked slowly back from the river with the cows. I passed the aroca tree where grandfather was. I stopped. Grandfather said nothing. He was watching the road. Suddenly, my mouth opened. Coca-Cola was my tight friend, I said. "I've noticed," said grandfather. "Now he is running back and forth, I said as Coca-Cola ran past. "Every 2 seconds," grandfather said. "I will help him," I said. "Number 7 is not so far off from number 1. Your grandmother and your mother and your grandmother and your sister also need you," grandfather started to say. "No, number 1, no, number 1. No, I'm sorry, number 1. It was Auntie Fine. "Your mother said I should call you," she said. "The palm nuts are ripe." Grandfather looked at me quickly. I returned the cows to the compound, turned towards the farm. The palm nuts give palm oil. The stew are made from palm oil. Yams and plantains are fried in palm oil. Where there is nothing else, we dip our soft food in. We dip our soft food in palm oil. In fact, without palm oil, there is no such thing as good food. As soon as I reached the farm, I attached a rope around my waist and started to climb. I smiled. Who can't be the happy up in the tree? At least in the first hour before the back and legs begin to ache. From the ground, Mom and aunties were shouting, "Make you hurry-o! Let me stand here all day waiting for you to collect. Don't forget before you eat the oil, we have to press the nuts. Reach the top. Why you go so slow?" I pretend. I can't hear them from the high up in the tree. I can see the whole village, the whole road, where grandfather under the ayoka tree, where grandmother is supervising the children in the village, readying herself to press palm oil. And there is Coca-Cola and Ma Coca-Cola by the road waiting for customers. I look down the dusty road, and in the distance I see dust, lots of dust. I lean out from the tree in the direction of Ma Coca-Cola's stall. "Bus," I scream. Bus coming soon." Coca-Cola leaps up. He looks down the road. He can see nothing, but Ma Coca-Cola shakes her head. "Bus," I scream. Again, Coca-Cola leaps up, and his time he recognizes my voice, and then he remembers I am number 1, the number 1 car spotter in the village. Ma Coca-Cola starts to cook her Acura double time. Coca-Cola runs fast to the river, carries many bottles back from the stall. He has time to make 2 journeys. By the time the bus is announcing itself with its rolling engine, from where I am in the tree, I can see the bus stop. The passengers all alight, and I can see the bottles of soft drinks dripping on the table, and I can see the people digging into their wallets. By the end of the day, I had cut many branches of palm nuts, all of which Mom and Grandfather were now squeezing into fresh orange red zesty palm oil, which they will use to cook our food. I've also alerted Ma Coca-Cola to imminent arrivals of 23 vehicles. At night, I'm happy to be on my own compound with Ma and grandmother and grandfather and Sissy. Outside the compound, I can hear Ma Coca-Cola talking loudly to everyone. My stall is the number 1 stall on the road, and that's because of that boy. I catch Coca-Cola's eyes peeking through the gateway. He smiles. "That boy," I hear Ma Coca-Cola says to the whole village, "is truly number 1 car spotter on the road." Chapter 4, Number 1 and the Wheelbarrow. It's me, number 1 car spotter, spotting cars for number 1 spot underneath the aroca tree. This is where grandfather sits. Grandfather, number 1 of all the number 1s. It used to be there was only 1 car on the road, grandfather remembers. The Perugat. 403, I shouted, followed by 404. But now things are much more interesting, grandfather. There are many more cars to spot, many more types to memorize, and many more to identify. Take the Pontiac Firebird, for example, grandfather says. There's only one in the whole country, one, and it belongs to a university professor. There's no B area boy car, the Firebird. It used to pass by here any time the professor went to his village. In the good old days, grandfather would challenge me, which one can you remember? Aston Martin, Audi, Bentley, Cadillac, Cezanne, Dagwood, Ellipse, Fiat, Ford, Golf, Honda, Suzuki, Jaguar, Jeep, Komatsu, Land Rover, Lamborghini, Lada, Mitsubishi, Nissan, Opel, Pontiac, Perutte, Porsche, Rolls-Royce, Seguta, Saab, Toyota, Uno, Volvo, Vauxhall, VW, X90, Yamaha, Zimmer. My grandfather would nod his head. Good, good. Those were the good old days. Then came the bad. Grandfather and I were still under the yucca tree, but in silence, alone. Grandfather had sent away all the people who sometimes sat with him there. We watched the road. He'd sent away all the people who sometimes sat with him there. We watched the road, but we were not spotting cars. Our thoughts were in grandmother's room. Grandmother was sick. She could not come out of her room. It was clear to everyone Grandma needed a medical doctor to perform a miracle, or she would die. Grandfather counted on his money, nearly every naira note and kabu coin he had ever saved over the years. His money was not enough for a medical miracle. I counted all her money and all the money my father had sent and managed to save, but it was not enough for the medicine. Not even together with grandfather's money, the money did not reach. My father worked hard in the city to provide us with shoes and school and medicine, but money like that can only be earned in the city. My mother sent a message to my father for money to save grandmother's life. Ma sent the message through one taxi driver who often passed our village on his way to and from the city. The taxi driver knew my father, and he knew where my father worked as a gardener in a rich man's compound in the city. But when the taxi driver next passed, he told us that he had not found my father there. There was another man working in the gardener's rich compound, and nobody knew what happened to my father. Since my grandfather has not moved from the yucca tree, I have not moved from my grandfather. My grandmother cannot move from her bed, and my mom does not move from my grandmother's room. Sissy struggles alone with the goats and the cows and everything, and she does not sing, she does not smile or laugh. Auntie struggles on the farm with the babies on their back at their feet. Grandmother is no longer in the compound to look after them. The aunties abandoned their farms early in the day to bring us food. Eat, eat, they beg. How could we eat? Grandmother was fading. Her eyes are fading before our very eyes, and Papa had disappeared. Suddenly, grandfather stood up and he looked down the road. Look too, what? There's nothing. Grandfather tried to walk towards the road, but at the time he had been sitting under the tree, and his bones had become old and stiff. Grandfather fell down. I shouted. Mom came from the house to see why. Sissy came to help me raise grandfather from the ground. And when he got back to his speech, grandfather turned again towards the road, using my shoulders for a walking stick. When someone came into view, walking down the road, grandfather forgot he was old, and grandfather tried to run. Suddenly, grandfather was not alone in running. My legs and Sissy's legs were running, poised by joy, overlooking grandfather. Papa, Papa! Mom came running out of the grandmother's. Akin, Akin, Akin! It was my father. Home. He took us all in his arms. He smelled of sweat and tiredness. The whole village came to celebrate. They had found food for us again that night. You see, Auntie Fine Fine, one problem was solved, another problem will also be solved. Now that he has returned, old Mama will improve, agreed Uncle Easy. He will look after everything, he said, Ma Coca-Cola. You have no need to worry. On every face was hope shining, but not for Papa's. Our son has returned, I heard Grandfather whispering to Grandmother from the door of her room. But when he thought everyone was asleep, I heard Papa say this, my wife, I have no more jobs. Olga turned me out 1 month ago. Since then, I have been an applicant. I have been going from one place to another. They all say the same, no job, no job, no job. Hola me, I have no money for the doctor, my father cried. The next day, I could not sit with Grandfather. I could see him underneath the okra tree. He kept looking towards my mother's room. He was waiting for my father to come out and call the taxi to carry Grandmother to the medical center. He was wondering why his son did not come out too quickly. I stayed behind Mom's Coca-Cola stall. Ma Coca-Cola looked at me. She looked up at Grandfather. She looked for a long time at our quiet compound. Ma Coca-Cola sighed. She cooked the fresh akara for me. 4x4. Coca-Cola shouted. I looked up. 4x4 was Mike. A non-government organized man called him what you like. He had come from the city to build a medical center. He had brought palm nut press. He had bought a palm nut press. Hey, Mike. Hi, Mike, Coca-Cola was shouting. Hi, the city style, just like Mike had taught us. I did not even feel like smiling. Mike bought us all some cold drinks, me and Sissy and Coca-Cola, Nike, Bi-Ci, Viola, and Back, and Emergency, and Tuesday, and the others. How is Grandmother today? Mike looked at me. I shook my head. Mike looked sad. She needs to go to a medical center, he says. I can give you a lift there. I shook my head. No money for doctor, I said. Mike looked sad. Then he smiled. Hey, I have something for you, he says. And I looked at him. He never gave us money, but sometimes he had chocolate, and sometimes he had chewing gum. Wheelbarrows, said Mike. Free to anyone who can sign to improve the village life. Coca-Cola and I looked at each other. Come on, said Mike. Surely smart kids like you can write your names. I can do that, I shouted. Last time Cousin Overtime was here, she taught Sissy and Coca-Cola and me to write our names. Excellent, said Mike. This village could do with a few wheelbarrows. We took our papers from the 4x4 on the wheel and showed us where to sign. The wheelbarrows are to improve village life. Not for selling, he told us. Sissy and Coca-Cola and I nodded. Yes, Mike. Okay, Mike. We signed, and Mike unloaded 3 wheelbarrows from the back of his 4x4. Ma Coca-Cola was dancing, singing, clapping around Coca-Cola's wheelbarrow. It could carry many soft drinks back and forth from the river. Ma smiled and beeped the horn and drove away. Mike smiled, beeped the horn, and drove away. Sissy and I slowly pushed our wheelbarrow up towards our compound. Papa was sitting underneath the oak tree with Grandfather. At last, they both looked as stiff as the tree. What is this? Papa asked. It's from NGO. NGO. Wheelbarrow, Papa, I replied. To improve the village life, said Sissy. Papa jumped to his feet and started shouting, Who will pay for this? They were free, Papa, Sissy said, crying. I could see Papa was struggling to believe this. The NGO gave it to us, Papa. I said, we only have to sign. Papa looked at Grandfather. He is the man who brought us the palm oil press. The same one who built the school and the medical center. He is a good man. For the first time, Papa went silent, and then he said, Will he come back? Will he come to take them back? No, Papa, I said. He does not expect us to pay him later, he said. No, Papa, said Sissy. They were free to improve village life. At last, Papa noticed. He walked around the wheelbarrow. He looked at us. Number one, Sissy, he said seriously, I need those wheelbarrows. Take them, Papa, I said. Sissy nodded. Our father took the wheelbarrows. He loaded one into the other. You are good children, he said. And without another word, without saying goodbye, Papa pushed the wheelbarrows down the road in the direction of the city. Grandfather and Sissy and I watched Papa run. 2 days later, a taxi came with an envelope for Ma. In the envelope was money for Papa, enough money for grandmother to go to the medical center, and for the taxi, too. Ma shouted and cried. Ma Coca-Cola started to shout, taxi, taxi, even though the taxi man was already there. Grandfather rose to his feet and started to praise God. Sissy started to cry, and all the aunties came to carry grandmother gently and place her in the taxi next to Mama, we waved goodbye. Grandmother and I watched the road for 2 days, and on the third day, Ma and grandmother came back. Grandmother was on her 2 feet, and for the second time in 1 week, grandfather ran up to the road. For the second time, he was overtaken, and when at last he reached her, the person who held on to her was the longest was grandfather himself. 1 month after that, the taxi man passed again. Again, he did not stop. This time he had a photograph for us. The photo of my father. In the photograph, father was standing with another man, and they were both pushing the wheelbarrow loaded high with stacks of bags and boxes. This is your father's new business, said the taxi man, explained. He carries people's goods from one place to another, and this is his business partner. We all looked closely at the photograph. My father's face was big with a smile. I saw Sissy's face and Ma's face and Grandma's face and grandfather's face, and this was a big smile too, but not on mine. Every time I heard the 4x4, I went down to the river and hide. Why are you going there, Uncle Go Easy? Is it not your friend's 4x4 that you hear? I did not say anything. Do you not like chocolate whatever anymore? Do you not like cocoa or whatever anymore? Go Easy persisted. I did not say anything. The man gives you a wheelbarrow to save your grandmother's life and you do not like him anymore? Uncle Easy did not give up. He said the wheelbarrow would improve the city life. I said, trying not to cry. And so, Uncle Go Easy did not understand. I signed to improve the village life. Is that so, Uncle Go Easy? And Papa took them to the city. I included crying. Ah, Uncle Go Easy nodded his head. He took me gently by the arm and steered me back towards the village. Look, he said, nodding towards the compound. There's Beck, Bisai, and Biola, Sunshine, and Smile, and all the other small babies playing with grandmother. Uncle Go Easy cocked his ear towards the farms. I could hear their mothers and aunties singing along with my mother. Singing as they hoed the fields together without the babies on their back or on their feet. They will eat very well next year, they sang. Look, Uncle Go Easy pointed back down the path. Sissy and her friend Nike were walking to the river with buckets of wash, laughing. Look again, he pointed out at the Oroka tree. Underneath, grandfather was sitting happily chanting the Odua Ethel Ifa and waving his fly swatter. People sat beside him, drinking in his words and nodding at his head. Suddenly I understood. The 2 wheelbarrows in the city had all made these people happy. They meant that they would eat well next year. In fact, the 2 wheelbarrows in the city were big improvements on village life. I looked up at Go Easy. Go Easy, number 1 said, walking back to the river. I watched him go. And then I heard a 4x4 engine even clearer. I looked up at the road and I could see it clearly but I knew. Mike, hi Mike, I shouted and ran towards the road. As I passed, I heard my grandfather shout, you see that boy? He is number 1, the number 1 car spotter in the world.